After hearing about the word's elemental power, Aang was curious about it, so Lena explains to him that the demons of the current time don't just simply have the red to black cores anymore. Aside from those 6 types, they had also now evolved the 5 different elements as well. Which was why the current generation of demons were even more difficult to defeat as compared to before in their time. Aang knew of those things as the 5 great elements, consisting of wood, fire, earth, metal and water. Which means that within his body so far, he was only missing the earth element. This is giving Aang the last bender vibes. After hearing about the elements, Aang wanted to know what it has to do with the warriors. Lena reveals to him that the warriors of today were able to combine the different types of elemental powers together. Aang was stunned to hear that the warriors of today were capable of that, believing that combining elemental powers were the same as his ability to control the elements. Lena further explains that there isn't just the stark difference in power between the quadruple and quintuple-finned warriors. The current quintuple-finned warriors who are strong enough often try their best to fight for a precious core called the integration core. Those warriors would enter a place called Dagora's castle in order to obtain more of that power to combine their elemental powers. The place she mentioned was somewhere that Aang was familiar with, as he could easily recall what it was to him. In the past, he had led one of humanity's toughest battles against the demons in that place. That place is now called the Cemetery of Dagora's Castle. He wonders if the place got its current name because of how that castle ended up being the center of countless battles. Lena continues to say that ever since the battle for Dawn, there have been countless humans buried beneath those corpses on that battlefield. Until one day, someone found a strange type of demon that they had never seen before. That unique demon turned out to be a quintuple-finned demon, but what made it different was that, in the space where the demons were supposed to have a demonic core, it had an integration core instead. It was a unique core that allowed warriors to be able to combine their elemental powers. But that doesn't mean that every single warrior was strong enough to use it. To her knowledge, only quintuple-finned warriors and above can use the combination. They needed to be able to sustain a ridiculous amount of physical resistance. Aang immediately questions her on whether he would be able to combine all 5 elemental types if he has that integration core, but Lena straightaway rejects his idea, calling it impossible to combine all 5 elemental powers together, stating that he could only combine with one. It turns out that all 5 elements have a negative or positive relationship with each other. No one has succeeded in combining multiple elemental powers, so in theory, it's impossible for a human body to be able to contain more than one elemental power. Even the current king in the new 6 talents could only combine with one elemental power. This was shocking news to Aang, as he just realized that they could manage to combine their elemental powers too. Looking back at his fight with Dylan, he couldn't even tell. Lena figured that Dylan wasn't even using his full strength, considering that the protective shield might not have been able to protect the audience if he had. She also knew that Dylan was a ridiculously conscious guy about his public image. If he had gone all out from the beginning, then Aang probably wouldn't stand a chance against him. Although Lena didn't want to admit it, the new 6 talents and their new king's strength had far exceeded that of the strength the former 6 talents and Aang had all those years ago. Not only do they have double cores, they also have elemental powers, which was one of the reasons why she wasn't able to save Desha from the dungeon. Deep in his thoughts, Aang knew that he already had 4 different kinds of elemental powers within his body, which made him wonder if it was because of the octuple-finned demon within him. But if Lena was right, even if he was to compare himself to the new 6 talents, such as Dylan, Aang could clearly see that he was far too weak against them. As a warrior, he couldn't keep relying on the demon within him for its strength. In order to rescue his former comrade, Desha, Aang was now determined more than ever to make himself even stronger than before. After hearing everything from Lena, Aang tells her that he had decided to make his way to the cemetery of Dagora's castle himself. But Lena was worried, since Aang wasn't a quintuple-finned warrior yet, and that there was a huge power difference between a quadruple-finned warrior to a quintuple-finned warrior. But Aang knew all of this, because the power difference was something that he had made a theory since his time from long ago, but in this current lifetime of his, Aang decided to no longer follow those same rules anymore, as he believes that he can break through those past restrictions himself. We now change scenes to see that Paris and Aang were walking through the streets of the city. Aang had brought her out in order to tell the person in charge about the energy crystal he needed. Afterwards, he decided to leave. Paris could only stretch her body as she had been awakened from her sleep, but she couldn't help comment that the youths of these days were so full of energy. She then assures Aang that she would personally guide him to the person in charge and vouch for him. But as he turns around to thank her for kindness, a familiar voice could be heard, mentioning that they had resolved the issue with reissuing Helios City's energy crystal. The familiar voice continued to say that they were going to make their way to the Warrior Combat Center to request for more aid. Lu could be seen, walking closely behind that familiar voice, who turns out to be their squad leader Jin. Aang could finally see his long-lost teammates right in front of him, causing him to stop. As Paris shouts Aang's name out loud, wanting to know why he stopped, Lu manages to hear it, causing her to turn around to see where it came from. An image of Aang was reflected in her eyes as she saw him. Her voice along with her body trembled as she pointed out to the others about Aang's presence. The entire Helios city team had finally found one another in the crowd of the city. The moment Aang called out to his team, they immediately made a mad dash towards him, even with their mouths wide open. Snow and Wei were the first to flung themselves towards Aang out of pure joy upon being reunited. Jin was excited to see him as well, giving him a firm handshake. He could also see that Aang had grown more muscles too. Snow, on the other hand, could notice that Aang had actually grown taller from the time they were apart. Aang explains that his physical transformation might have been affected because of the demonic cores he had. Snow then explains to him that they were here in the city with Brian City's instructor to watch the competition, and that Lu had been keeping an ear out for any news about him. Which was why they eventually left Brian's team in order to gather more information and to search for him. But somehow, they ended up with a wrong lead, which was why they ended up coming to Dawn City instead. Jin had also settled the issue with the energy crystal being redistributed first, so Jin explains that they were planning on looking for Aang afterwards, but they never thought that they would find him in the Dawn City too. Aang was glad to hear that the issue with the energy crystal had been resolved, as he had originally planned on negotiation with the representative about that too. Paris, who was behind him, could hear that Aang's issues were resolved now, so with a smile on her face, she leaves the Helios team alone to be reunited. Seeing that she was leaving, Jin thanked her for taking care of Aang this entire time, but Paris corrected him, saying that she and Pictia City were the ones that Aang had been taking care of. The moment Paris left them, Snow leans in to Aang and whispers that he needed to have a little talk with Lu, explaining that since he left them, she hasn't been able to eat most of the time. Wei even brought out her camera to show Aang some pictures she took of Lu, showing how dark her face is, and how it looks as though her spirit has left her body. Even though everyone had spoken to Aang, Lu remained silent with a dark look on her face. Aang slowly walked out to her, and called out to Lu saying, "Leader, I'm here to report for duty. Sorry for making you worry." Upon hearing those words from Aang, Lu's face started to gain color as she becomes embarrassed. She simply gives Aang a light punch on his chest. Looking at him with sincere eyes, she tells him that next time, don't leave the team on your own like that. Aang could only smile and agree to what she said. As the Helios team started to chat about their reunion, a familiar green hood was seen in the alleyway near them. It turns out to be Lena, who was watching them closely. She couldn't help but smile after seeing the situation Aang was in. After all, it reminded her of how they were many years ago. We now begin this chapter with a scene of a place filled with skeletons. Aang and Lu could be seen together. She was out of breath, carrying Aang on her shoulder slowly through the hallway. She told him to hold on as Aang was bleeding heavily as the corpses of demonic beings surrounded them. It looks like Aang was unconscious but was holding tightly onto an integration core in his hand. Covered in wounds, Lu was trying her best to get them to a safe place, telling Aang repeatedly that he couldn't fall asleep and that he needed to stay with her. But as she tries her best to carry him to a safe place, Aang's hand appears to slowly lose its strength, and eventually, he lets go of the integration core, allowing it to roll across from them. Reminder, the integration core was something that allows warriors to integrate the elemental powers of a demon. After dropping the core, numerous demonic beings appeared in the shadows above them, laughing at the fact that there were only low-level warriors present, and that this was the end for all of them. One of the demonic beings jumps down, roaring at Lu and screaming for death. Lu wasn't able to react in time to the demon's surprise attack, resulting in her being stabbed in the chest. The demon's attack was strong enough to throw her across the hallway, but it could still see that she was barely moving. Aang was bleeding on the ground next to her, so she tried to reach out to him. In her final moments, she realized how weak she was, and apologized to Aang for not being able to protect him. As she tried to reach Aang for the last time, Lu woke up all of a sudden with a scream. She was breathing heavily while being in her nightgown, slowly realizing that what she saw was simply a dream she had. But as she got up from her bed, she wondered why it felt so real, even the pain of being stabbed. As she lets out a deep breath, she tells herself to forget it as there was no use in thinking about it. Looking at her body, she could see that she had sweated quite a bit, and decided to take a bath. But as she was going to, Aang slams her door wide open, concerned about her as he had heard her shouting just now. But as he spots what she was wearing, Aang became shy all of a sudden and realized that he had made a mistake. Seeing his rude action, Lu answers back with the words "you pervert" and with a pillow to Aang's face. But her attacks don't stop there, as Lu continues to whack the shit out of Aang, scolding him for entering a girl's room without knocking, being beaten ruthlessly. Aang tried to reason that he did it because of her screaming, but it only resulted in him being beaten up even more. Eventually, after the beating, our boy was kicked out of the room. After preparing her stuff, Lu and Aang had left the C-rank city's hotel. But as Aang called Lu by her name, she appears annoyed with him, telling Aang to call her leader instead. Which he smiles and agrees to without hesitation. He asks if she had rested well since they had a long schedule ahead of them today. Lu tells him that she did, even though she had a nightmare, but what's more embarrassing to her was that just moments ago, something embarrassing happened, and yet, Aang still had the same calm look on his face. With a map out, Aang explains to Lu that they will be making their way to a C-rank city, a place that they have to pass through in order to get to the cemetery of Dagora's castle, so if they make their way there at full speed, they should be able to reach the cemetery of Dagora's castle before evening. But there was a condition to enter the castle: they needed to win a battle against the city guards, or else, they would be seen as trespassers. Which would be troublesome for them. Lu recalled that Jin had mentioned before that the castle is now an important strategic location these days, as it was designated as a place where quintuple-finned warriors that are strong enough are able to obtain the integration core. A wall was specifically built around the place, and there are a couple of high-rank warrior military groups stationed around it as well. The entire city's external areas are guarded closely, not just to prevent warriors from entering illegally, but also to prepare for the day when the demons inside might come out. That's a defensive mechanism against whatever is inside the castle too. Hearing that, Aang questions Lu on whether she was afraid to enter the castle with him, that even though it was a request from Jin, he never thought that she would agree to it that easily. Especially since it's a place that only quintuple-finned warriors dare to step foot in. Lu explains that Jin was more worried about how reckless Aang was going to be, and without a green core regeneration type warrior with him, he would be in danger, and it just so happens that Lu was a green core warrior. Turning around, she explains to Aang that she wasn't doing this for him as she had a mission of her own too. Jin wanted Lu to level up together with Aang, so by the time they were back, Lu would have raised her rank to double-finned warrior. But within her mind, Lu was furious over how Aang was able to level up so quickly. He had gone from a single-finned warrior to a quadruple-finned warrior in such a short time, showing her how good he was, which made her mad. Aang understood her reasons. After all, he recalled that Snow and Wei were also receiving special training from Jin in order to level up. Lu reminds him that she was the leader of this team, and in light of how Aang had left his team on his own previously, she was also here to keep an eye on him. Seeing her look on when they had first reunited, Aang couldn't help it but smile to himself. When Lu spots it, her first reaction to his smile was that it seemed lewd to her, making her think that he was thinking about that embarrassing moment from earlier on. The scene then changes to a battlefield-like area where numerous warriors were gathered together, shouting and requesting for different types of warriors, from green core regeneration type to agility type warriors, where they had to at least be a quintuple-finned core warrior. This place is the cemetery of Dagora's castle, the main door core testing battle preparation zone. Aang and Lu had finally arrived at the castle where the integration core was inside. But as they walked past the other warriors, they were soon noticed by them. The crowd around them couldn't believe that there was a quadruple and single-finned core warrior together, making them believe that Aang and Lu's thirst for power had driven them crazy and that they were only here to provide nutrients to the demons inside the castle. They continued to make fun of them, calling them a couple and betting that Aang and Lu wouldn't even make it past the strength test. Hearing all those remarks, Aang could only laugh at them. Unleashing their auras as they walked, Aang tells Lu that apparently, they were being looked down upon.
Thanks for watching the latest part from the voice of Manhwa. Subscribe for more content and don't forget to comment below what you want to see in the future. Like and share for more.